Welcome back to the program. It's the Vicki McKenna Show. And we had an 8-1 United States Supreme Court decision that said you can't ban types of talk therapy because the government says so. All right. We had that decision based on a Colorado law that said you are not allowed as a counselor to do anything except affirm gender dysphoria. So it functionally shut out counselors from counseling kids or anybody from, trying to figure out what trauma caused them to become gender dysphoric. Well, Wisconsin had functionally the same law in place. And after the Supreme Court decision, one would expect the Evers administration to instruct the Department of Administration to remove the language that would have prohibited counselors from doing counseling. But it hasn't done that. And so lawsuit time, ladies and gentlemen. We have Rebecca Furdek, who's from Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, who now is filed on behalf of two clients, two therapists in Wisconsin, against the Evers administration because the Evers administration is making it impossible for them to do their jobs. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Vicki.
All right. So we've got a Supreme Court case, right? That seems to be, the book is closed. Why are we filing lawsuits? Why is this going on when it's pretty clear what the Supreme Court intended?
Well, that's a great question. And this federal lawsuit we filed is challenging, as you say, a Wisconsin administrative rule that in part bans voluntary, client-driven talk therapy pertaining to sexual orientation and gender identity, depending solely on what viewpoint the therapist says out loud. So in other words, the government wants to essentially pick and choose which perspectives it allows, and it's banning the perspectives, frankly, that it doesn't like. In other words, as you say, the rule applies to all licensed professional counselors in the state. And under the rule, counselors cannot say out loud perspectives that may attempt to align one's gender identity with his or her biological sex. Wow. Even if that's literally why the patient is seeking out counseling, seeking out that type of perspective. But if the patient is coming in and saying, I'm having these feelings and I want to depart or transition away from my biological sex, then yes, as you say, the therapist is allowed and frankly encouraged, I guess, to affirm that individual.
So this is the thing, right? If you say, if you're a woman and say, I think I'm a man, and you walk into a therapist's office, that therapist is required by Wisconsin administrative statute, which has the force of law, to say, all right, let's get to it. How can we make you a man? How can I affirm that you standing in front of me, who are obviously not a man? That's fine. But if someone says, well, let's maybe take a look at some of the trauma that's happened in your past. Maybe we can figure out why you're having these feelings, and maybe we can encourage you in healing in such a way that would make you identify with your biological sex, right? You're not allowed, right? Not. But, Rebecca, the Supreme Court says the exact opposite. I mean, could it be any clearer?
Right, exactly. March 31st, a case called Childs v. Salazar, the court held in an 8-1 decision. So, the members, several members who are considered more liberal on the court as well, held that a substantively identical law in Colorado amounted to viewpoint discrimination, which the court said is the most blatant type of First Amendment violation. And just going back to the example you provided, for instance, what's even more egregious about this is many individuals, when they might be facing some confusing feelings, they seek out therapy, and sometimes they want to seek out therapy to help them align the feelings about their gender identity with their biological sex. And so really this is government trying to step in one-on-one private talk therapy sessions and to push a perspective that only the perspective that it favors. And not only is that wrong, but yes, it's contrary to a recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling. And there was a little back and forth between us and the Evers administration before we were forced to file this lawsuit because, frankly, it didn't need to get to this level, but here we are because the rights of counselors in this state matter.
So this is, by the way, it's just viewpoint discrimination. Now, the two counselors you are representing are licensed counselors, and they are both Christians. So it's in these two particular counselors, that we're talking about here, it's viewpoint discrimination and religious discrimination. I mean, you kind of get a double whammy on First Amendment violations by the Evers administration for these two, but it could be anybody. It could be anyone who just says, look, I think the trauma in your past has something to do with your feelings. What about people who are in sort of this trend? It's now the fad, it's the trend, but mom takes you into the therapist and all of a sudden, you're being told, oh, yes, you are a boy, or yes, you are a girl, when the opposite is in fact true. And they're just reacting to whatever the latest contagion trend is. Now that same therapist is supposed to actively harm somebody.
Well, and to be clear, the Colorado law had a little more focus on children, but the Wisconsin rule applies to adults as well. So again, I could be an adult and I'm going in because, again, I want to reduce these feelings. I want to align my gender identity and biological sex, and I can't even seek out that type of help. So it impacts patients in a sense as well. And you do raise an important point. Our clients are a licensed professional counselor, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and they integrate their clinical training with their Christian faith. But this is not just a Christian issue. It could be a counselor with any belief that informs their clinical training. I mean, it could be another faith, for example, a Muslim counselor who may happen to share the same perspective. So I want to make that point too. This is widely applicable to any number of counselors.
So if these two, as of today, did what somebody came into their counseling services, and it was a gender identity case, and they just did not violate their faith. Would they lose their license? Are they at risk of just complete professional ruin? Does it also include fines? What kinds of penalty are we talking about here for just like doing what you were trained to do?
Right. Well, as we point out in the lawsuit, yes, there are substantial consequences that attach to violating the rule. So in theory, yes, they could be punished by literally just providing advice that aligns with their faith. And it can include reprimand, a denial, limitation, suspension, revocation of their licensing credential by the state of Wisconsin.
So the inability to make a living. Sorry, you can't have a job in the field you were trained to do. You're not able to make a living. Feel free to go try to get a couple of gig jobs to push to piece together. So this, again, you mentioned something that's important as well. This covers adults in Wisconsin in addition to children. A voluntary contract for service. Someone goes in, wants the help, and it wouldn't even take that person to complain. It could be anybody to complain, right? I heard that this person was counseling this man and he thought he was a woman and now he's wearing pants again. It's something that's, it's so radical that it could include somebody who is not the person voluntarily contracting services, correct?
Well, there are a number of different ways that someone might, bring a claim or, approach the state of Wisconsin with this. In this instance, we're just focused on the counselor and what the state says they would do to generally enforce the rule, not necessarily what would happen or what would trigger a state investigation. But you're right. I imagine that an investigation could arise in a number of different formats. Okay.
So what you were going to get, and what was the concern about Colorado, which is, quite radical, is that people get activist about this stuff. They go seeking the kinds of people that they then can make complaints about. This becomes a way to stop healing of people who are suffering. And we should point this out because it hasn't been in the course of this conversation. 97% of people who say that they are gender dysphoric, 97% find a way to get over that gender dysphoria with appropriate therapy. That's astonishing. That's a tell that this is not something permanent. This is something that is disordered. This is something where you need to seek therapeutic help. But when you have that kind of statistic, that tells you everything you need to know. Is that if you identify as a boy and you're a girl, by the time you're 23 years old, 97% of the time you have gotten past this. You've had someone help you but you have gotten past this. You've essentially outgrown it. And so, I mean, I'm talking mostly about kids, but adults at age 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old. I mean, it's bananas because it's not permanent unless you induce someone into more psychological and traumatic damage. You're not going to create this as a sense of permanent identity.
Well, and you make several important points. And number one is the issue about activism. And I will say that before filing this lawsuit, we sent the Evers administration, the secretary of the agency overseeing this board, CCing Attorney General Josh Call, urging them to repeal this administrative rule. And, we were met with some pretty inflammatory rhetoric, including mentioning that Will is apparently bullying Wisconsinites. And, it's literally quite the opposite. I've only had the privilege of working at Will now for about a couple months, but I'm pretty sure that Will's mission is quite the opposite. It's to ensure that our government is not bullying individuals into silence. And
you can't bully. They can. The government is the biggest bully on the block. So you're being attacked. Again, it's an activist campaign. You're like, look, here's the law, whatever you guys think it will. And I know most people are conservative at will, but whatever you think, you look at the law and you say, this is the law. You're in violation of the law. Where is the attorney general? Shouldn't he be out there saying, look, governor, I'm the attorney general. This is a clear violation of the law. We have a very overwhelming Supreme Court decision. You're going to lose this case. Nope. He's not weighing in.
Yeah. That's a great question. No, he's not weighing in. He was CC'd on Governor Evers' letter back to us that I just mentioned. And there are about 3 weeks left before the administration has to respond to our complaint that we filed in federal court. So I guess we'll see what the administration says then. But yeah, it's hard to say.
I almost want this to go to court. I do. I feel bad for the people who right now are stuck in limbo, knowing that they have a Supreme Court decision on their side, but also fearing the big bully on the block called state government. But I'd like this. I mean, I'd almost like to get this into a place where it gets to the court so that an immense amount of smackdown comes from the black robes. Because there's really no way you can contort yourself to make this any different than the law that was just struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. So,
well, here's what I'll say.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I will mention earlier this month, during the pride flag raising event at the Wisconsin State Capitol, Governor Evers referenced the lawsuit and said, again, I have no intention of repealing the ban, and reportedly said, period, end of story, no question. It is a question, and it's one that was resolved by the Supreme Court, and I guess will now have to be resolved by a federal court here in Wisconsin.
Yeah, and apparently you just don't run afoul of the political sensibilities of the hard left. Rebecca Furdek, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, thank you for being on my program. And again, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, what would we do without them? You can go to will-law.org if you'd like to learn about the cases. But if you think you might have a case, then please use their Contact Us link at the very top of the page. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Vicki.